here you go.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's always nice to talk to a group of people thinking about doing good. And this session is about how you set up charities and their close cousins, social ventures, from a legal and governance perspective. So there's quite a lot in these slides. They're designed to be used after the session as well. And I'm not going to read them all out or go through every point of detail, but I wanted to set the context, some of the key things you need to think about when you're planning an organization, designing one, setting one up, and then running one of these purpose or impact driven types of organizations. So to outline out what I'd like to cover a bit more specifically. So what are the key factors? Talk through those. Specifically for this kind of group, I imagine that a lot of what you're doing might involve working cross-border, and there are some particular additional things to think about, because most charity regulation, most charity law is on a national basis. So you can't.
Can I just interrupt you there for a minute?
Yeah.
We are seriously, in a sense that we want to extend the work, probably most likely Singapore and US. And also in the US, we are collaborating with another charity that is very close already. So I really look to the details here. Thank you. Yeah. Okay,
that's great. Well, I'll make sure I spend time on that. And then I've got a few tips for charity registration applications if you're doing a charity registration in England yourself, and there's some top tips there. And the last bit is about the social ventures that I mentioned, just alternatives to the charity model. And I'm also going to cover why you might choose something that's not a registered charity. Okay, so if you're thinking about doing good and setting up a new organization to do that, what would you think about? Well, I'm going to use a few examples in this slide, hopefully to make it a little bit more real than just talking about legal concepts. And before I go into using those examples through the presentation, I thought I would introduce each of them. And these are all clients of ours, because I know more about them and I know they wouldn't mind me talking about them. And let me run through who they are. So Low Risk is a community interest company. It's based in Cambridge, and it does open source silicon, so open source hardware computer chips, primarily designed to improve security. It's backed by Western Digital, Google, and some other really big players in the technology industry, and it works on a purely open source basis, so everyone can benefit. Co-Farm in the top right is about a community farming movement, and that's set up as a registered charity. What it's doing is trying to develop a new concept of community farming with a combination of aims that are about sustainability in the farming methods, about bringing communities together and helping them eat healthily, and also about conducting research on how all of that process works, and then using that research to inform methods of farming and methods of healthy living and sustainability around the world. On the next line, Matrix is a decentralized communication platform. Think WhatsApp, but not controlled by any one organization. And the idea is that it would be able to connect, for example, your Facebook Messenger with your WhatsApp messages. So it's a kind of common language that people use to communicate between different messaging platforms. And that's set up with a non-profit foundation at its core, designed to provide the kind of trust and security that people will need, a little bit like Low Risk, using a non-profit model. The Camelthorn Foundation is a conservation charity based primarily in Zimbabwe and primarily trying to conserve rhinos, but also helping the local community as a means to doing that. And Ocean Mind uses satellite technology and its own proprietary algorithms to track shipping around the world, primarily with the aim of preventing overfishing in conservation areas and generally in fishing zones, but also increasingly to tackle modern slavery, where people are kind of stuck on fishing boats and can't get off, and the fishing boats kind of never come back to shore, so effectively kept as slaves. So those are all different types of non-profits. They all have a legal structure sitting behind them, and they all have slightly different structures to meet their particular needs. And I'll go through that as we run through this session. So what are the key factors? If I was sitting down sort of one-to-one with you, what would I be asking about to recommend a particular legal structure or a particular approach? Well, these are the five key areas to think about when you're designing a legal model for a purpose-driven or impact-driven organization. The first one, and at the top, is what is that purpose? And why are you doing this if it's a purpose-driven venture, or what are you trying to achieve if it's more impact-driven or outcome-driven? Can you write that down in a few lines? Because if you want to set up a charity or a social venture, you will need to do that, as well as to explain why you want to do that and how you're going to do it. But the starting point, can you write down the overall aim you're trying to achieve? And one of the things that I see most is people going into the details. They talk about how they're going to do things. And really, for setting up any of this kind of organization, you need to work out why as well. And you need to be able to write down why. So you might be advancing health or advancement of health, or you might be relieving poverty. And you might well have an incredibly detailed set of plans for how to achieve that. But the overall goal is about relief of poverty or advancement of education or health or something like that. And to set up a charity or a social venture, you need to identify what that is. The second area is people. So who's going to control your organization? Who's going to run it day to day? Who will own it, if anyone owns it at all? And how will they all interact? Where will the power sit? So when you start to reduce all of that into a legal document, you need to have some pretty clear answers or work through some pretty clear options to be able to pick the right structure for you. And some of the different legal options between charities and social ventures, and I'll show you a scale of those at the end, allow for greater control for you as founders potentially, and some of them require you to give up a degree of control. Finance, we'll come on to some specifics about financial models in a minute, but how will your projects be financed? Are you looking at grant funding? Where will that grant funding come from? Are you looking at revenue from consultancy or offering other services or licensing intellectual property? What's the source of funds that you would like to receive? And particularly, would you like investors to come in? Because if you've got investors who want to buy shares, then you need to look at a particular set of models for that. Intellectual property is always a big part of any design for things that are related to universities. Where does the intellectual property develop? Do you need that intellectual property in your venture in order for it to succeed? What are the restrictions you might have in licenses? Or what restrictions might there be in research grant agreements about using that kind of intellectual property developed in the research in a commercial context, or even if that's being done by a charity? So you need to understand the limits that you might have or the permissions you might need before you can design the right type of organization to get those consents or make use of those options. Governance. Now, this is a subtly different thing from people. This is about how your organization will take decisions. So will you have one group of people taking the decisions? Will you have some people with reserve rights who maybe meet only every few months but supervise things or provide input into strategy? Do you want some sort of advisory council to support you along the way? And are those people who are willing to accept some sort of legal duty as a director or something like that, or is it a different role? But how will decisions be taken? Where will the power ultimately sit? And how will you allocate that between people? Those are important things to pin down as part of the legal design for any kind of charity or social venture. So those are the 5 key factors, and I've got a few more slides now to explore some of those in more detail. But I know from this sort of talk before, it's easy to get very bogged down in some of the details here. So I'm going to try and move through these slides relatively quickly on the basis that if people are working through these points at some point in future, then they can come back to the slides and use them for that.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Before you move on, I noticed that in a lot of the form that I filled in, I can't remember which one, maybe HMRC, maybe Company House, they are very concerned about one person holding more than a third power or something. So does that mean that the governance structure, there's some expectation about minimum size?
Yes. Yeah. And
is there a number that you know?
There isn't a legal minimum for a charity in terms of so what I think you'll be talking about is the number of charity trustees.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Who sit as, if it's a company as well, a charitable company, then there'll also be the company directors. And in some cases, there will also be the member of the company. So for a charity exists for public benefit, and it's essentially a form of public asset. So the charity regulator, particularly the Charity Commission, but also HMRC, are concerned about having a public asset in the hands of only one person.
All right.
Because there's an increased risk of it being used for that person's own sole benefit. Is
there a minimum number?
There isn't a legal minimum, but we find it difficult to get anything registered with less than 3 trustees.
Okay. 3 and above will be fine. Okay.
Yeah. The best practice in the charity governance code is 5 to 12.
5 to 12. Okay.
But for an early stage venture or an early stage charity, 3 is a realistic minimum. if you set up a different type of organization that's not a charity, so a social venture, then you can set up something with one director and one member that's the same person. So if you want just you to be the director, just one person to be the director and the founder and the member and everything, then you can do that, but not as a charity. You can do it as a different type of organization.
Okay.
Community interest company, for example.
Yeah.
And that point about control is one of the main reasons why people move away from the charity structure, because they don't want to hand over control of the project to a group. Well, typically the trustees are unpaid volunteers, so you're not just handing it over to people you brought in and are paying. You're bringing in people and saying you've now got control, but you're all volunteers and you've got lots of other things going on. And sometimes people don't really trust that kind of group with their own, their baby with their project, so they use different structures instead.
Okay.
Yeah, great. So we've gone the wrong way there. Let's move on. So this is a slide just to help think through some of the key points on purpose and impact, particularly for charities. So if as a starting point, yes, so what is the social impact goal? Ideally with a theory of change around that. Those of you in the academic world will know that better than I will. My wife is an academic and was doing a theory of change mapping exercise yesterday, and I know she has a much better understanding of it than I do. But that's how it ties in. What is that overall goal? And then you need to sort of write it down, typically in slightly legal language, for defining the purposes. And there are lots of good examples on the Charity Commission website. There's a list of example charitable objects in lots of different fields that you can see. For examples, you don't have to use one of those, but they give you good examples. You can also see the charitable purposes or objects of other registered charities by searching on the charity register and looking through that. So there's lots of other lots of ways of seeing other examples. But there's a fairly standard method of writing those, understanding who you aim to benefit. And that can be a specific group of people with a certain set of characteristics. So people in poverty, for example, or people in a particular geographic area, or in poor health for particular reasons. Or it can be kind of humanity as a whole through, for example, conserving the environment. You don't need to identify which specific people will benefit from that.
I think I asked you this question before. How easy or how difficult it is to amend the charitable purpose?
It's very hard. It's the short answer.
No.
Yeah. So once you set a charitable purpose, you can't change it without the permission of the Charity Commission. And what process you use depends on what type of legal form you have, if you're a charitable company or something else. So you need to make a case to the Charity Commission to explain why it needs to be updated. And you also need to check that things like the funding you have isn't tied specifically to your charitable purposes at the moment. So if you don't have any external restrictions like funder restrictions or donors have donated for your specific purpose at the moment, if you haven't got any of those restrictions, then you need to go to the Charity Commission and explain why the purposes need updating. And it will listen to you and it might give approval, but it's not guaranteed and it's not wholly within your control.
You said just now, depending on the company type. So is the charity type. So is there any particular type that is easier to change or harder to change?
If it's a trust and a charitable trust or an unincorporated charity, that's harder to change. It's got some kind of quite arcane rules around changing purpose of those. If it's a charitable company or a charitable incorporated organization, a CIO, then it's a bit easier to change under provisions in the Charities Act 2011.
Okay, thanks. Yep.
It's one of the areas of charity law that's hard to do yourself on your own. I think I'm trying to explain in this talk how you can do lots of things on your own, but changing purposes is quite a hard thing to achieve.
Yeah, and I noticed I'm not sure whether this was the Charitable Act 2011 or is on the English Charity Commission website. There is obviously, they list the type of charitable purposes. So I just wonder whether that list ever changed.
So when the Charities Act 2006 was introduced, that list was updated. But the last thing on that list is anything else that is similar to the above or recognised in English law as charitable. So it's not a closed list.
All right.
It evolves over time. So you don't feel too restricted by that.
Okay.
And the list is in section 3 of the Charities Act, I think, or section 2. It's a list of what are known as the descriptions of charitable purposes, and there's 13 of them. And some of them have been the same for 500 years and some of them are new. So they do change.
Okay, right.
Okay. So if you're writing charitable purposes, this is the third column on this slide. some key things that they need to be and not be. They need to be charitable purposes, and that means they can't be political. But you can't have a purpose to change the law. And that's not just about party politics, it's also just generally about changing law or policy. So you can have a policy, you can have a charity for sustainable development, and as part of that, you can campaign for climate-friendly policies. What you can't have is a charity that is designed to have a particular law changed or have a particular law introduced. It has to be under the banner, it has to be an activity of a charity with a broader purpose. And what you can't also do as a charity is align yourself closely with any particular political party. And then in terms of the other main requirement of a charity is to be for public benefit. And what that means is it can't be for private benefit. That's the key point. So the benefits have to be available to a sufficiently large class of people. And there also have to be not too many obstacles to that benefit. So it's a big debate about fee-paying schools in the UK, for example, about whether they can really be charities. And that comes down to this point about public versus private benefit. But it comes up in lots of other ways as well. So if you charge fees for what you provide as a charity, do those fees make what you do inaccessible to too many people so that you don't exist for public benefit?
Just a little interruption there. The charity, as far as I know, they can have either a trading subsidiary or they can conduct some trading activities.
That's right.
Can you correct me? Do I need to set up a subsidiary in order to do trading, or I don't have to?
It depends on quite a complicated set of legal and tax assessments there. So a charity can do some trading if it's primary purpose trading related to its purpose. And it can do a certain amount of exempt trading up to a particular threshold in the tax rules. But outside of that, it should set up a trading subsidiary.
Yeah.
So it's not a straightforward answer.
Okay, so when you say, for example, we have this digital passport, COVID digital passport. Originally, the charity is about giving it to the care home, serving the care home. But if it has got some commercial use, let's say going to the football stadium or something. So this football stadium then is not a charitable purpose.
Yeah.
And then, so it doesn't need to be like public benefit or something. Yeah.
So if you're doing it as an activity to generate money,
income, yeah,
the charity then spends that money on its purpose,
yeah,
then it would be non-purpose trading, and it should probably be done in a trading subsidiary. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Let me move on. I've got lots of slides, so
okay,
to keep moving. So governance. This is the point about who has control. So it's usually people who are called members or shareholders, and then who leads day to day, who has the kind of oversight day to day, and that's the directors or charity trustees for things that aren't companies. And you can, in some forms of charity, they can be the same, wearing different hats. So one group of people who are members of a company or members of a CIO, also directors if it's a company, and also charity trustees under charity law. So wearing all of those different legal hats and one group of people in control. Or you can have it split and you have people who are a bit like shareholders and people who are a bit like directors running things day to day. And where do you find out what the situation is? Well, in the governing document. And for a charitable company, those are the articles of association, just like a normal company. For a CIO, that would be a constitution. And for some types of other types of companies or charities, there might be things like rules or bylaws or other types of governing document. The other place to look is what's the local law or English law here. So there will be rules in the Charities Act about governance as well. And if you're looking at other countries, they will have similar rules in their overall laws. And I've mentioned tax as well, because HMRC's practice on tax relief for charities, what it will recognise as charitable for tax relief purposes, also drives charities' behaviour as well. So that point you made earlier about having a minimum of 3 trustees, if HMRC says, well, we won't give you a tax relief unless you have 3 trustees, then everyone has to do that anyway, even if it's not a rule of charity law. That's all I was going to say about governance, just introducing some terms and sources to look for information. Some common issues to plan for. The first one, the control versus getting paid, I've mentioned already. It's the point that generally charity trustees are unpaid. It's a voluntary role. And that's a pretty important principle in the charity sector in England and Wales, at least. So if you want to be in control of the organisation and be paid day to day for running it, it's quite hard to achieve that within a charity structure. You need a special permission from the Charity Commission to be paid as well as being a trustee. The second area to look at is managing conflicts of interest. So if you have other roles elsewhere, particularly if it's roles with anyone supplying the charity or in a contractual relationship with the charity, or supplying intellectual property for the charity, and that can be a university role if there's a relationship between the university and a charity. You need to have quite careful systems to manage those conflicts of interest. Location of directors. You don't have to have directors in the UK for a charity. Charity trustees don't have to be based in the UK, unlike under some legal systems, but you do need to be able to meet, and it's certainly usual to have at least one person in the UK. And the last one is what are your setup and ongoing costs? Well, you can set up a charity in a way that doesn't kind of have an annual cost. It doesn't have to pay fees to the Charity Commission. The Charity Commission doesn't charge for anything. If you set up as a company, you have some small fees every year. Really what you need to think about there is they're quite complicated organizations to set up, and rightly so, because they exist for public good. So how much do we need to invest each year to kind of keep on top of things and make sure we don't have some sort of regulatory problem?
Sorry, the location of director. Is there any sense that you need to have majority UK or just minimum one UK?
There's no legal rule that you have to have any in the UK, so I think one is fine.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah. Fine. That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to be a UK charity, your work has to have a connection with the UK, and you have to have something in the UK that is subject to the jurisdiction of the courts in the UK. But you don't have to have the directors here.
Okay.
We were talking about Ireland. You do need Irish companies have to have a director based in Ireland. UK companies don't.
Okay, thank you.
So I've given a few examples of purpose and governance here. I'm not going to spend lots of time going through those because they're quite detailed organisations. But low risk, to give you an example, has a small group of members. These are like the shareholders. There's 3 of them, and then its directors are a bigger group of executives and non-executives. So they've split their member group and their director group, so that a small number of people who founded the company have control, and then the directors bring in a wide range of skills that they need to run the organisation. And their governing document is a set of articles of association because they're a form of a company. Camelthorne Foundation has a constitution as its governing document because it's a CIO, a charitable incorporated organisation, which is a special type of corporate charity. And it has 3 trustees who are the same people as its members. So it has a group of 3 volunteers who act as the members and also act as the trustees. And then day to day, it has a staff member who's paid, and they're the ones who runs around doing everything every day, but they're not a trustee and they don't have control of the organisation. So those are a couple of examples. In terms of finance, so I'll go through this relatively high level. Some of these will be open to charities and some of them won't be open to charities. So at the investment and debt end, charities can borrow money, but they can't really receive investment in shares, for example, because charities are not allowed to pay profits to any shareholders, if they even have any. And charities are not allowed to hand their assets to their shareholders if they wind up. They have to pass on all of their assets to another charity with similar purposes. So they're not an appropriate thing for an investor in shares to invest in. There are some forms of investment that charities can get, slightly more new forms of investment, so social investment. And that might be where an investor might fund a project and take some of the revenue from that project, but it's not investment like you would see in the venture capital world. It's not investment in exchange for shares. So if you think to make your project happen, you need to line up lots of venture capital investors and get lots of money in, you won't be able to do that if it's a charity that you set up. But charities can borrow money, and quite a lot of them have used the coronavirus loan scheme, for example, to bring money in. Revenue. By this, I mean sort of doing something and generating paid revenue, and that's increasingly common for charities. Provide services, give access to something, and people pay you in return. Providing courses is a classic one, or training people to training other people. Grant funding, or to an extent crowdfunding. You'll all be familiar with how grant funding works. It's a major source of funding in the charitable sector, and usually comes with a certain degree of obligation to report and follow programs and all the kind of normal things for grant funding. But obviously you don't generally have to pay it back. Crowdfunding is more common for social ventures than it is for charities. I think charities tend to, they almost do large-scale fundraising activities with lots of people donating, but they don't tend to use kind of crowdfunding platforms. in part because crowdfunding implies usually getting something back in return. And most of the time, charities are seeking donations without any promise to give something back in return. The last area is licensing and franchising, which is where you're intellectual property driven as your charity or as your venture, and you use your intellectual property to generate money by letting other people license the intellectual property, or perhaps you design a whole model. And so let's just move on so we can see some logos on here. Co-Farm is a good example of this. Co-Farm might set up a franchise business to generate money for its charitable purposes, where it works out how to run a community farm, writes down the manual, gets the branding, makes all the connections to do it, and then sells that pack to people to franchise. It's not, you might think of franchises as things like Burger King and McDonald's and so on, but it's possible to do the same thing in a charitable context too.
This morning, Chris Optley mentioned something like EIS and SEIS. Is that something to do with the investment part?
So that works if you're investing in shares. It doesn't work if you're investing or making grants to a charity. All right, thanks. Yeah. So that's a venture. That would be in the sort of venture capital world. So social ventures can be structured to work for SEIS and EIS, particularly SEIS. But a charity can't generally receive investment that way, I don't think. It would be worth checking the criteria for SEIS though, because maybe someone thinking about it, maybe some of those social investment funds I mentioned that receive a return from income streams rather than from dividends, they might be able to structure that in a way that works for SEIS. Okay. I don't think EIS would work though. That's very much driven by kind of commercial structures.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So finance. I don't think I'll go dive into this slide. I've covered most of it on the previous ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people. How does the people bit of it all work together? So usually the structure, as I've mentioned, is you have the organization, the charity or social venture. It has a board of directors or trustees. I'm using directors here, by the way, because if it's a social venture, there'll probably be directors and not trustees. You only have trustees in charities, not in social ventures. And then there'll typically be a group of staff who will then be kind of implementing things and paid a salary to do that, or paid a consultancy rate to do that. That's your basic corporate control structure. It goes down from the top. The charity has the authority to do things, enter into contracts, hire people, things like that. It delegates that to the board, often fairly automatically under company law or charity law, and then the board then tasks staff with doing things. So the delegation of power flows down and the accountability flows back up. So here's a slightly more sophisticated version of that. You have the delegation going down one side of the power to bind the company, to get the company or charity to do something, and then the accountability flowing back up. So in this model, we've got an executive director or CEO added in to lead the staff team. And I've shown on the other side of the slide the kind of legal documents that govern those relationships, just so you understand where those fit in. If you have people showing you these legal documents, or you're considering which ones you need, this is the typical picture for the people side. So you have the Articles of Association, as we mentioned, that's the governing document. You have to follow company law when you're dealing with those things if you're a company. You might have a members or a shareholders agreement. So that's more common with a social venture than with a charity. It's a private document. The governing document is a public document. Members or shareholders agreement is a private document. And you agree how you're going to run the company. So you agree, for example, you might agree not to use company law powers to remove someone as a director. If you didn't have that agreement, then people could just use company law to do removals and things like that. So it's about deciding how you're going to run the company and recording that while you're all friends with each other, generally in case of any disputes down the line. But as I say, much more common for a social venture or any kind of commercial company than a charity. Charities don't generally need those. So for board directors, executives and non-executives, you often have director appointment letters, particularly as things start to scale up. And that's where you say to your directors, you have to keep everything confidential. We expect you to be in 4 meetings, 6 meetings a year, 1 meeting a month, whatever it is. You can claim expenses or you can't claim expenses, or you might be paid a fee or you might not be paid a fee. And this is how we decide to part ways. You have to give us notice, we have to give you notice, whatever it might be. And that's usually an add-on to whatever's in company law, whatever's in the Articles of Association, because you can remove a company director under company law without having any of these documents. There's just rules under company law that exist. But if you want to make it work in a smooth way and you want to add in things like confidentiality provisions and expenses, well, they won't be in company law or in an Articles of Association document. So you need a simple appointment letter to do that. And then for your executive directors, CEOs, staff, you'll then typically have consultancy agreements or employment contracts, depending on what exact role people play. So that's typically the picture of legal documents you end up putting together. And you don't need all of these on day one by any means, but that's usually what people are working towards. So some of the people things to think about. So you're ahead of as before. So so incentive schemes, SEIS, EIS, can you use those? Can you use management EMI schemes is the other one you hear, or your management incentives. So some of them you can use as a social venture. Not very many of them you can use as a charity. So if one of the ways you're planning to motivate people in your organization when you're planning a new organization is to say, well, if you work really hard for a few years, then you can have a big payout in the future. Well, don't set up a charity because you won't be able to make that big payout to the people down the line, or it won't be very easy to do that. But you probably can do that with a social venture or a commercial venture structure. The other points on here about aligning your team with your purpose and impact, and using the idea of your purpose and your impact and your theory of change as a way to motivate people and bring people into your organization. Or volunteering, you can use volunteers, but you need to be quite careful about local regulations. You need to make sure you're not sort of unwittingly bringing people in and putting them as employees and then not paying them the minimum wage if they are properly employees. If they're coming in and you're telling them what to do all the time for 6 months, then are they really a volunteer? Are they allowed to stop when they want, or do they have to kind of give you 3 months notice and really they're an unpaid employee? And sometimes other rules around the world, even linked to the sort of modern slavery legislation. You just need to be a little bit careful. You can use volunteers, but you need to be very clear that they are volunteers, not secretly employees that are unpaid. You need to think a little bit about the ethics of that too.
Which law is that?
Which law? There's a set of laws called the minimum wage regulations.
Okay.
In the UK, but depending on where your volunteer is working, there might be other laws that apply to them. And then the last bit there is when you employ someone, as opposed to bringing in a consultant, you need to set up something within the organisation to do payroll, collecting payroll taxes and things like that. You need insurance as an employer as well. So before you take on your first employee, there's a package of things you need to do, which are not that complicated. And obviously loads and loads of companies are created every year to start taking on new employees and go through that process. So there are lots of streamlined ways of doing that. But you do need to pause before you put your first employment contract in place and make sure you have that system sorted. So those are common issues to think about with people. I know you talked about IP earlier, so this is probably a good thing for me to skip over because this is a very outline IP strategy, and I know you've heard from people who know more about IP than I do.
Yeah.
That was some examples of IP. So we're on to the cross-border bit that I know you were looking forward to, and different ways of working from the UK overseas and with partners. So what I've got on these slides are some key questions you need to think about when you're planning working overseas. And then I've got some models of typical legal models for how people do this. So working cross-border, and often people have obviously answered almost all of these questions or these and lots more, but it's a useful list hopefully to fill in any gaps. So why are you doing it? What's the impact you're trying to achieve with which market or which group are you trying to achieve that impact? You need to understand that before you enter a new territory, enter a new market. How are you going to do it? So this is the different models I'm going to come on to on the next slides, but you could do it directly as your UK charity or company. You could set up a local subsidiary company that you own and control and then do all the activities through that. Or you can find a partner and give them the resources, intellectual property, money, maybe lend them some people so that they can deliver it under their own legal structure and balance. A slightly different question, who are you going to do it with? What resources in the country do you need to work with? Do you need people on the ground there facilitating? Do you need access via different institutions there? And what do you need to think about from a regulatory perspective? So some countries you can kind of turn up and work and you just need to think maybe about visas. Other countries, India is a classic example. If you go there and start doing business things in India, you risk the whole of your business coming under Indian tax. So I, as a lawyer, for example, cannot go to India and start practicing Indian law or even English law in India, because the whole of my law firm, everything everyone does worldwide, may suddenly be subject to Indian tax.
Really?
And that sounds extreme, but it's quite clever. It's quite carefully designed to have that effect. It's supposed to protect Indian law firms, so it's not.
Sorry, did you say that if you go and practice in India, then your whole firm will be taxed under Indian regulation?
Yes, basically. Yeah, and that's designed to protect Indian law firms from being taken over from overseas. That's the point. So I don't know what it works, how that plays out in the social sciences field, but what I would say is don't assume that you can just go and operate somewhere without having tax consequences. You need to check.
Okay, that's interesting. That's important to know. Actually, it's interesting.
Yeah. I think that's an extreme example, and therefore a good example to illustrate the problem. But that's the kind of question you might want to have, and it's been coming up a lot with remote working and COVID. What if one of your employees decides to go to India for 6 months and work from there? Have they put the whole of the company's business into the Indian tax regime? And that's a genuine risk for lots of countries if the person in that country is generating business. So if you have someone who moves to Portugal, which I had for one of the companies we were talking about on these slides, they were trying to work out if that person goes to Portugal and in Portugal contacts customers and tries to build new customer relationships, the revenue that the company generates from those customers might well be subject to Portuguese tax, not to English tax, because it's all happened in Portugal.
In fact, this point is very relevant and important. I think Jason will know that because we are tech-based, so in fact, the easiest source and the most important source of these tech, programmers, developers, they are all mostly Indian.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, earlier we have Chris Oxley was saying that if someone is working in such a conditions, and then this person could be defined as an employee rather than a consultant, contractor, and then depending on the HMRC kind of set of question, whether he has the discretion of deciding what he's going to do, that sort of thing. So what you're saying here is that if we have one programmer in India suddenly becomes our employee, then suddenly we can have the whole structure being taxed under Indian law.
I don't know whether you get the whole structure taxed under Indian law. That might be specific for law firms, but you definitely have a risk of becoming subject to Indian law if you have someone in the country who could be treated as your employee.
So like one of the very important projects that we are involving just now is to digitize the supply chain. So it will be from India all the way back to UK with a UK brand. So if we are deriving income from India, does it mean that we will be taxing in India then?
I don't know. It depends on Indian tax law. And I'm afraid of all my specialisms, Indian tax law is not. It's a problem I'm aware of, but I'm not a specialist. So normally what we would do in that situation is speak to an employment lawyer. So I would phone up one of my colleagues who's an employment lawyer and say, you deal with these problems all the time. You know how it works. How do we find out if this is a problem or not a problem? And they would say, well, either actually that one looks probably okay, we don't even need to go and get Indian law advice. Or they'll say, yes, that does look like a potential problem and it depends on the details. So what we're going to do now is line up an Indian lawyer who does this all the time and knows what the Indian law is, and they can issue a legal opinion to give you the answer one way or another. That's normally how it would be done.
Okay, right, thanks.
Okay. So the last bit here then is about when. So really entering any new country is quite a significant project. It's not necessarily huge, but it needs a bit of planning. You need to get all the different elements of it in the right order, and you need to work out if you need a budget for it, and if you do, what that is. I've given a link on this slide to something called the Practical Law Global Charity Guide. So Practical Law is a set of legal resources that most lawyers have access to. We have paid for access, so I wouldn't subscribe to it. It's quite expensive. But this part,
I know that
global charity law is free.
That's
you can
great.
Look at things.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I know that we are running short of time. Here you did not cover like raising money abroad. So I know that like, for example, if you want to raise money, I know that in the States, for example, Seth is here. So 3 years ago when we set up the company, And then I remember that, like, even in the United States, you know, if you set up in one state, you can't raise money in another state. Do you know what I mean? So, does it mean that it will be very, I think then I remember, like, it's very difficult when you get donation over the internet. Then it's very difficult to decide where the money come from, whether it is UK money or overseas money. Do you know a little bit about how people handle this?
Yes, they usually use a platform like Just Giving, who works it all out for them. I think is the short answer.
Then you can get away without this kind of having to know where the money come from, is it?
Yeah, so you have to be careful about money laundering and the proceeds of crime.
All right.
So you need to, generally there's a level of understanding where your donations are coming from, and there's guidance from the Charity Commission on how to do that, and know your donor kind of type.
Okay,
what
fine.
the level of risks are.
Okay.
Generally it's not as much of a risk for charities, because when people give you money, they're not expecting to get it back. Where you have to watch out for is if the money comes in and then suddenly people are asking for refunds, then you're potentially looking at kind of a money laundering scenario, because you're being used to launder the money to make what might be the proceeds of crime look clean, because it's gone through your bank account and back out again.
Okay.
If you're receiving money in and then spending it on your charitable purposes, that's not a very big money laundering risk, because it's not going back out again to a criminal. So you have a situation. There's been some scandals in the UK about, for example, there was the President's Club, where lots and lots of donations were made, but they were being made at events by, you may have read about this in the news or seen it on the news, and lots of middle-aged men and lots of young women acting as waitresses, and lots of allegedly inappropriate conduct. And that was a charity running that and generating quite a lot of money. And there was a big question about whether Great Ormond Street Hospital, which had received some donations from this charity, should give the money back because it was tainted by the way in which it was raised.
All right.
And as a result, there's some additional guidance about how would you give money back, and in what circumstances should you give the money back, that sort of thing.
Okay.
So in the public consciousness, a charity can be tainted by the source of the money it receives. So that's typically why most charities try and work out what's the ultimate source of their money. It's not come from arms dealing, it's not come from criminal activity, it's not come from someone whose own personal ethics don't conflict with the charity's mission. They don't want to be associated with that. So they work out what the source of funds is.
Okay.
And if you're talking about getting little bits of money from lots of people, then using a kind of relatively well-known donation platform like Just Giving or something like that.
Yeah, Just Giving is good. Yeah.
It is good. Or the Charities Aid Foundation have a CAF donate product that you can use, that people can donate through, that sort of thing. So you find essentially a financial institution or a large institution that also has a reputation to uphold, and you make sure that they're involved in receiving the money as well. And then they usually have some sort of checks in place.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. The US is quite unusual in having a ban on public fundraising at state level. So in the UK, there's some fundraising regulations, but it doesn't say, for example, you can only raise money in public if you're a charity. Anyone can go out with a bucket and say, I'm raising money for my beer fund, and they're allowed to ask people for donations, and it's up to the person donating whether they want to or not. If you were sort of doing that kind of fundraising for something you claim to be a charitable project in parts of the US, then you'd be breaking a US law. But it's not the same rules here. It's more targeted rules.
Okay.
And that global charity guide tells you a bit about fundraising rules in other countries as well.
Okay.
Great. So this is more about, we were just talking about fundraising. This is about delivery in those other countries. So you've got direct operation. What that means is your English charity is the legal organization doing things in the country. So it's signing contracts. If someone has an accident, it's the UK charity that's responsible for that accident. There's no other organization involved. It's just the UK charity operating in that country. And in some countries you can do that, and in other countries they say you're not allowed to operate here without registering locally.
Okay.
Then if you do want to register locally, you can do it in two ways: as a branch or as a subsidiary. And the legal difference there is a branch is basically a label for your English charity working there. So you registered it there, but it's not a different legal thing. It's the same thing with a kind of label and some registration details in the country. So it's the same legal entity. And if you ran up a debt in that branch, it would be the overall organisation who would be responsible for that debt. The English charity would still be responsible.
Yeah.
A subsidiary is about setting up a different legal entity, another company, which is owned and controlled at the shareholder level by your charity. And then if the subsidiary has a problem or runs up a debt it can't pay, or has employees it can't pay, it's a subsidiary that is then insolvent and has to be closed down, but the debt doesn't transfer to the English charity generally.
Yeah, I think I know about the legal entity, but what about like taxation? The branch will still be locally taxed, is it? Yeah.
It depends on the local tax rules. It might be locally taxed on the local activities, or it might be exempt because it's a non-profit organisation, or it might not be taxed because there's some sort of tax treaty between the UK and that country.
So to some extent, you set up a branch only if you have no choice, and then you need to have a local presence in order to do the local jobs. Then you set up a branch or something. Yeah. Otherwise,
if you're doing quite a small project, I suppose, and you had to register a branch, for example, to receive some funding in the country, you might use a branch. If you're doing quite long-term projects, the branch probably isn't the right way of doing it. Probably a subsidiary or working through a partner or something.
Yeah, subsidiary just means that you need to set up another company again, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. But it depends really on the risk. If there's not really any risk to your English charity, then you can look at the branch options. But if there's a risk that you can't supervise closely what's going on in that country and there's some big legal claim, it could take down the whole charity. And
all right.
That's when you wish you had a subsidiary instead.
Okay.
So then employer of record and local partner. I'll illustrate how those work on the next slides. It's easier to understand them with the diagram. Well, local partner is not that complicated, but employer of record is easier with the diagram. So this is the direct operation or the subsidiary branch office here. So you've got the social venture, or it could be a charity, and it's doing direct delivery under the direct operation model. And on the subsidiary branch office, as we were just talking about, what goes across border is not the delivery, it's the ownership. And then the delivery happens locally in country.
Okay.
So we talked about those two.
Yes.
Then you've got the next ones. This is where it gets a bit more complicated. So if you don't want to set up locally, but you want to have some people in the country delivering, say you want to hire 5 people for a year in that country, or 3 people for a year, or 1 person for a year in that country, but you don't want to set up a subsidiary. Your options are either hire them in the UK under a UK employment contract and kind of send them there and hope that doesn't make you subject to the tax rules there. Or you can use something called an employer of record company. And these are essentially service companies that exist on a kind of global basis, and they already have a subsidiary in Kenya, for example. And what happens is that their company that's in Kenya employs the individual in Kenya for you, and you have a contract with them. And under your contract, you're allowed to tell that individual what to do, but they're technically employed by this local service company that already exists and employs lots of other people doing lots of other things for other organizations too. Okay. And because of that, they're already set up with the local authorities. They know how the taxation works. They sort out all of the payroll and local social security payments for you. And what you do basically is pay what you would pay the individual plus a percentage on top to fund all of that for the employer of record company. So it's quite a quick way of having a small number of people in lots of countries. But the percentage that they put on top, it varies by salary and by country. It can be quite significant, up to even 50% of the salary again. Okay. But if it saves you setting up a whole new company in a new country and doing accounts for that company and so on, it can be worth looking at, particularly for a shorter term project. So that's an employer of record, and giving you an example of one, the Safeguard Global is quite a well-known name.
Okay.
And then you've got working through local partners. And so this is what you're sort of hinting at there. This is where no entity in your group is doing the direct delivery. You work with a different separately run partner. It can be a local partner, or it could be an international partner that just has a local presence. And instead of doing the delivery directly, you have a partnership or a grant agreement with them. You provide the resources we were talking about before, money, people, potentially people. But typically mainly money, and then that local partner might employ people using the funding that you've produced, and then they deliver the work, or they might use their existing people to deliver the work. And that's generally less risk for you because you're not the one delivering on the ground. And I guess you have the benefit of they're already generally set up and they've had all the systems and they generally know the local environment. So that's a relatively common way of doing things, particularly
last time when you talk, I remember, let's say, what about like Oxford University, and then they have the Friends of Oxford University in the US.
Yeah.
So is that a local partner or is that a kind of different subsidiary?
That's for fundraising purposes rather than for delivery of
work. Oh, right. Okay.
Purposes.
Okay.
So the reason they have the Friends of Oxford is because it's a US registered charity and therefore it can generate tax relief for donors in the US.
Okay.
So if I, as a UK taxpayer, donate to Oxford University, I get a tax benefit under the UK tax rules. But if I was a US person under the US tax residency and I donate to University of Oxford in England and Wales, I wouldn't get any tax benefit because it isn't registered as a US charity.
Right. So that one is only set up for raising money. And
That's
then
right.
It has nothing to do with employment.
Yeah.
Fine. Okay, fine.
So to take a different example, Oxford has a kind of research center in China, through Oscar Center, which is a collaboration with another research institution in China, and it provides people and resources and intellectual property to that center for it to carry out research there. Not specifically about China, it just happens to be based there. And that's an example of Oxford working with a local partner to deliver work and impact.
Okay. So it's a different entity, right? Yeah, different entity.
Yeah, it's a different entity and it's one that you don't control. So if it's a subsidiary, you control it. This is someone you don't.
You can write as many contracts as you want in between. I mean, between you. But
of course you can. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
Yeah. But ultimately, the only rights you have are the ones you've written into the contract, not,
that's right.
Not ownership. You don't have ownership.
No. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I might do is show you what the rest of the slides are and then pause for more questions, if that's okay, because the rest of it's mainly about tips you can use another time. So there's some tips about charity registration applications, where to go to register a charity, and then some tips about how to register. Some of the main things that kind of people get stuck on. And then alternatives to the charity model, I've mentioned social ventures. And it's not really a legal definition, but it's more of a description of different types of businesses that are somewhere on this scale. This is our social venture scale that we invented 2 years ago. It's not the clearest for when we're talking about charities, but it hopefully gives a sense of charity at one end, purely purpose or impact driven, and a purely profit generating business at the other end. And then when I talk about social ventures, I mean everything in between, as a mix of purpose or impact and some element of profit as well. And some of the things on this scale are more like a profit generating business, and some of the things on this scale are more like a charity. And they're at the other end.
But the CIC, you don't really get tax benefit, do you?
No, you don't get tax benefit.
Yeah, and then you don't get this kind of donors having their tax relief, that sort of thing. That's right. Yeah. Okay.
And you still pay corporation tax as well. So you don't get any tax relief as a CIC. What you can get though is some grants that other ones on this scale can't. So and what a CIC can do is it can have one director and one member, and have one person can have complete control. They can be on the board and be paid a salary. They can also receive 35% of the profits paid up.
I think to be honest,
some benefits.
Yeah, to be honest with you, for me and for us, the fact that the charity, the name, it just gives some transparency, because we do a lot of work and then people want to know whether you're making money out of it, you know.
Exactly. It's the purest form of saying to people, this is altruistic, this is for public good.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. Yeah.
Great. And then I just showed where the different examples I had fit on this scale. I mentioned some movements. What's a social enterprise? What's tech for good mean, which is basically anything you want it to mean, and what's a B Corp? And then that was it. And I have lots of links in the back of this slide to the examples, to setting up a charity, to funding sources, and governance, impact, and people stuff too. I think there's a bit on IP strategy and international expansion. And that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just saying to people before you join, I think we nearly finished now. You remember last time when I was calling you for help, and then because our charitable purpose is human right, And then I was arguing with the English charity whether helping the care home is under human rights. And then they told me no. And then you told me to ignore their letter. I think that was when the charitable purpose really freaked me out.
Yes.
to know whether, so if I'm doing something that somehow they decided not within my charitable purpose, what is going to happen?
So if a charity does something outside of its charitable purposes, then the trustees who've supervised that, or the ones who are in control of the charity, are in breach of duty, the duty to comply with charity law in their governing document. And in theory, that spending that has gone outside of the purposes of the charity might need to be repaid to the charity by the trustees personally. So that's the worst case scenario is you've spent £100,000 on relieving poverty, but you're actually a human rights charity, and that £100,000 that's gone, you don't get it back from the sort of impoverished people it's gone to, but the trustees have to make up the difference so that the charity still has the same amount of money left for human rights as it would have done if it wasn't a breach of duty.
Yeah.
And then if there's a really big problem and it's happening on a widespread scale, then the Charity Commission might say, well, actually, I'm afraid, but you lot aren't fit to be trustees anymore, so we're going to ban you from being trustees.
I mean, like I'm just kind of just being cheeky in a sense that, do they audit? I mean, do they check? Or unless you're waiting for tip off?
They don't proactively check very much, but they do get something like 200,000 messages a year with complaints and tip-offs and things.
Okay.
And they decide which ones to investigate.
Okay.
It's very common for charities to accidentally do things outside of their purposes. But if you genuinely want to take a charity in a different direction, it's much better to contact the Charity Commission and have a reasoned plan for why this charity should go in a different direction, and ask them to approve that.
Yeah, I think we nearly time's up. So one last question. We are now working very, very closely with an American charity called Soterra Institute. So we are working together this kind of COVID track and trace. If we want to have a much closer relationship, is there any way? I mean, like, it's not like if you're a company, then you got the share exchange. Is there any way where we can declare legally like a sister institute or something? There's no way of doing that.
Well, so there are some English charities who have shares and who have shareholders who are US charities. So,
all right. So it has to be a share structure. We are limited by guarantee.
So you could bring them in. I can't remember exactly what your articles say, but you could change. If they don't say the right thing already, you could change them to make the US charity a member.
All right. Okay.
Then you would have a.
At the moment, I think we are a foundation. I think there's a foundation and the association, isn't it? I think we are under foundation.
That's right. So that means all of your trustees are your members.
Yeah.
So you could change to an association model.
So is the trustee a human? Can a trustee be another charity?
Are you a CIO or a company?
I can't remember what it is. It is a charity. Yeah.
Yeah. So a company.
It doesn't matter.
Can't be. Yeah. Generally, it needs to be an individual, but you could give them the right to appoint someone, and then someone that they appoint to be a trustee is a trustee.
I think it's not too. I mean, it's not too desperate. It's not like a company. You know, I think if we are just publicly declare that we have very close working relation, I think that is sufficient.
Yeah.
Yeah. After all, we are all charities.
Exactly.
All right then. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's been wonderful. And there's so much reading in all your lists.
I'll send you the slides afterwards, and then you can share.
All right then. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. So we'll close the session now. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Martin, for staying this long. And James and Jason and Seth. Seth, we have to catch up. Yeah, at our meeting. Thank you. Bye. Bye, anyone.